Hi. Today we're going to be talking about the evolution and the neurobiology of behaviour. So we're going to start on the part of the course we have been headed towards, and we'll start to take a look at how evolution has shaped our brains and how our brains shape behaviour. And in this course, we're going to be looking at the evolution of behaviour, cooperation, competition, and neuroeconomics, and behaviour genetics. And in the first section, the evolution of behaviour, here we're going to be covering some points, the key points of evolutionary biology, which include inheritance, variability, and differential fitness. And then the building blocks of behavioural evolution, which includes individual selection, kin selection, and reciprocal altruism. And all of these are the foundations on which we try to assess behaviour in terms of evolution. Now, the key points of evolutionary biology. So it is built around three key points. Inheritance of traits across generations, variability of heritable traits among individuals, and differential fitness. So first, inheritance. No surprise there. Inheritance is the passing on of traits from one generation to the other. Next is variability. So variability is passing of mutations in genes or genetic mutations from one generation to the next. And differential fitness means that some genetic mutations that are passed on are adaptive or more adaptive than others. And sometimes we call adaptation fitness. However, you will find that I very rarely use the word fitness because the word adaptation is more appropriate, I think. Because some mutations are neutral, they neither help nor hinder, and other mutations are fatal. Of course, the fatal ones wouldn't be passed on to the next generation. So the organisms with adaptive mutations tend to survive and reproduce more than the maladaptive ones. So if you have inherited a mutation, a change in the gene that helps in the particular environmental situation you happen to be living in, then you are more likely to survive than someone who hasn't got that mutation. And you have to bear in mind that the evolutionary environment was an extremely dangerous one, fragile, life was fragile. Every day was a battle for food and survival. There were plenty of times where, like ice ages, for example, where some mutations would have been much better for adaptation than others. For example, if you had a bit of hair on your body, you might be a bit warmer than someone who didn't. Therefore, the adaptive mutations get passed on more than others. In other words, because the maladaptive ones tend to die out and don't reproduce, then the adaptive ones get passed through to the next generation and then the generation after that. And although contrary to popular opinion, it's not survival of the fittest. It's not about who is physically fit. It's about reproduction of the fittest. So the people who are best suited for surviving the particular environment that they're living in are going to reproduce and pass their genes on. So it's not about bopping other people on the head because you happen to be the strongest and then surviving. No, it's nothing like that. It's about who survives to have babies and whose babies make more babies and so on. Now, the building blocks of behavioural evolution are individual selection, kin selection, and reciprocal altruism. These three things are the very basis of thinking about evolution. So whenever we're thinking about evolution, we'll be looking at kin selection, group selection, and reciprocal altruism. Now, kin selection. What that means is that our genes want to pass their version onto the next generation as much as is possible. That, in other words, our genes would rather dominate the whole of the human species rather than the genes of the people next door. So what happens is that any behavior that promotes the survival of our family, of our gene group, will, of course, do exactly that. So we go to a lot of trouble to make sure that our kin, the people who carry our genes, survive and reproduce. And there's a saying that says, I will lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. What that means is that 2 brothers are more closely related. They got more of my genes than 8 cousins would. So to have the same amount of genes for 2 brothers, you need to have 8 cousins. Yeah. Now, reciprocal altruism is where we discovered that if we cooperate with other people who aren't kin, then we get to survive better and they get to survive better. So it's a win-win situation. If it's just a kin thing and you're going to wipe out anyone else's kin, then that's a zero sum. That means that only one person wins. But in the reciprocal altruism, that's called a non-zero sum. In other words, everybody wins. So if I do you a favor and then sometime in the future you do me a favor in return, then we have both won. And it occurs in social species, like I said, among non-relatives. It ensures sharing the risk of food, and food among the hunters. So when you are hunting, then you take risks, and when you come back from the hunt, the food is shared more or less equally. Well, not quite. There's a funny little twist there, but it's shared amongst non-kin as well as, in fact, you probably find it's shared more among non-kin than among kin. The reason for that has to do with social standing. In other words, social standing, or where you are in the pecking order, was very, very important in evolutionary times, and we'll get into that more later. It ensures that the labour in community projects is shared, so it's not just one family doing it, it's a whole bunch of families doing it. And vampire bats, for example, not exactly humans, but they go out and they hunt blood at night, and those who didn't get a fair share, in other words, those who didn't succeed in hunting blood, are given blood by the other bats, even though they're not related. On the proviso, of course, that on the next night, if the one doing the giving had a shortfall, then the one who was given to would be obligated to share their take with them. Now, the requirements for reciprocal altruism, you have to have a stable social group. In other words, it can't be breaking up and reforming and breaking up and reforming. The lifespan of the species must be long enough, or individuals in the species must be long enough for everyone to benefit from cooperation. In other words, if you were a species that lived one day and you did a favour for one particular member of the species who wasn't kin, then chances are you or them could possibly be dead the next day and it wouldn't be reciprocated. So you must live long enough in order to reciprocate the favour. Now, the species must be able to recognise other members of the same species. So it's handy if you are a human being and you recognise that other critter over there is also a human being, and you could possibly have a win-win situation if you share something. And also, the species must have the capacity to work out who's cheating. In other words, who's taking but not giving. And that was a very important thing in reciprocal altruism, that cheaters get found out and dealt with. Now, the next section, cooperation, competition, and neuroeconomics, is a short one, but very important. Neurobiologists in recent times have scanned brains of human beings, particularly when they're doing a particular exercise of cooperating or competing. And they found that the greatest amount of dopamine, the pleasure hormone, is secreted in a human brain when the person involved is cooperating, doing a cooperative exercise. And if it's a competitive or like a conquer the other person type of exercise, then there's much less, there is some dopamine, but much less dopamine. So you actually get less pleasure from beating someone than you do from cooperating with them. And that says something about how our species evolved. If we didn't have that mutation, then, I mean, if we hadn't indulged in cooperation, we wouldn't have that mutation now, and vice versa. Now, the next section is behavior genetics. And in this section, we'll take a look at what does a behavior geneticist do. We'll look at genetic determinism. We'll look at behaviours that run in families. Look at the question of same environment and different genes. And we'll look at twin studies. We'll look at genes versus the environment, and finally, genes and behaviour. And firstly, what does a behaviour geneticist do? A behaviour geneticist infers that something is genetic by comparing patterns of shared behaviours and shared genes in a population. So if a population or any species has a predominant or a common behaviour pattern, then you can reliably say that it's most likely a genetic one. Now, genetic determinism, one of the great bugaboos of evolutionary biology and psychology is the other people, ignorant people, making claims that they're delving into determinism. In other words, that we have no free will, and all our behaviour is determined, and therefore we're not free. Well, there is an answer to that. And genes don't determine your behaviour. They give you a propensity to do certain things. But if you're aware of this propensity, you have the choice. You can do it or not. Also, you could have the gene for a particular behaviour. And because the environment does not switch on that gene, we have to bear in mind that the genes don't switch themselves on. There have to be environmental conditions that switch genes on. And if the environment does not switch that particular gene on, then that particular behavioural propensity won't operate. So genes only cause propensities or tendencies to a particular behaviour. They don't make us perform that behaviour. And just as a side note there, genes tend to control us, although we'll find later that's not actually the genes controlling us, but we'll talk about that later. But for shorthand, we'll say the genes get us to do what they want by giving us feelings. So a lot of our feelings come sort of technically from the genes, although the way that the mechanism for it is actually in the brain, not in the gene itself. But the gene constructs the brain. Now, we've noticed sometimes that behaviours run in family, not just eye colours and hair colour and height and all that sort of stuff. It's actual behaviours themselves can run in families, and close relatives can have more genes in common than distant ones. Therefore, you'd expect that genetically influenced behaviour would be more common amongst close relatives. And also, families tend to create the same environments. mainly because that we come from the same grandparents and great-grandparents, and they tended to do things the same, and they pass their habits and lifestyles down to the next generation, and so it goes. So not only do we have a common genes or common genetic influence, we also have a common environmental influence in families. So it's very hard to tease out what is caused by genes and what is caused by environment alone. So if you get a situation where someone is raised, or a number of people are raised in the same environment but have different genes. Now, let's say, for example, adopted children or foster children. You could have a family of adopted children. None of them they're not called genetically related. They have quite different genetic backgrounds, but in theory, they have the same environment, same growing up environment, because they're all growing up in the same family. Although having said that, I think anyone who has been a parent or who has had parents or who has observed parents or all of the above would note that the parents don't always treat every child the same. So not every child experiences the family in exactly the same way. But in a broad sense, in a global sense, yes, they are all in the sort of generally same environment. And what they've noticed, the studies have noticed, is that people with different genes raised in the same family tend to have widely differing behaviour patterns. And if that's the case, then it's most likely that these particular behaviours, are genetically caused or genetically influenced. Now, twin studies, these are twins that have been separated at birth. So they have identical genetics, give or take a couple of maybe small parts of a gene, because not everybody is absolutely identical. Even identical twins aren't absolutely identical. But you take identical twins and you put them in different families. Well, no, you don't put them in different families. They end up in different families for whatever reason, adoption, being orphaned, or other reasons that children tend to get adopted out. And so you've got same genes growing up in different environments. And many studies, I mean, the different countries in the world have put quite a bit of effort in digging up these identical twins. I mean digging them out of the ground, but locating them, tracking them down, so that they can be studied, with their consent, of course, to find out what are the similarities and what are the differences. And some of them are quite striking, right down to two brothers, identical twin brothers who had never met, who turned up at the same interview, wearing identical clothes. and they used to go to the same place on holidays, but didn't know each other, of course. So it's spooky. So twin studies add a lot of weight to the influence, the confirming that there is a genetic influence on our behaviour. However, having said that, when it comes to science, we have to remember that science is not the process of discovering the truth. Science is a process of becoming less wrong. So any reputable scientist will admit that when all experiments and all their theories, all they end up doing is proving that the theory they had before is now wrong, but that doesn't mean that the one they have now is right. It's just a question of, what do you call it, successive approximations, getting further away from mistake and getting more towards less mistake. However, having said that, now we look at which is the greatest influence, genes or environment? And the short answer is it's impossible to know exactly how much is environmentally of our behaviour is environmentally induced and how much is genetically induced. remembering that there's two things happening here. One, the genes, although they exist in our every cell of our body, they will not be particular genes won't be activated unless the right environmental conditions exist at the time. If those environmental conditions never occur, then that particular gene will not be activated. So there's a definite environmental trigger process happening there on the gene. On the other hand, environment alone may not give a person a propensity for a particular behavior. For example, if someone comes from a long line of geniuses and the genius, what do you call it, the genius gene was either removed or deactivated, it's unlikely that the environment alone will turn that person into a genius. And on that score, there's some evidence late that the reason some people are geniuses and some people aren't is because our right brains, which do not use language, so our right brains don't think in language. The left brain does. So the right brain can actually comprehend a hell of a lot more about life, the universe, and everything than our left brain can. Now the problem is getting the information from the right brain to the left brain in a form that the left brain can understand. It only works on language. It's limited by the language in a particular type of language it thinks in. So my theory is that people who are geniuses are people who either through some genetic mutation or through maybe some lifestyle practice they have, which enables them to be able to still calm down their over talkative left brain and listen to the messages coming from their right brain in pictures and feelings and all sorts of things. So that's my version of genius. So if you encounter a genius like Einstein, for example, and many others, that the chances are that they were people who had either genetically or had worked on developing the ability to receive information from their right brain, which knows a hell of a lot more than our left brain does. Okay, so the best guess that the experts have about how much of which gene or environment is involved, again, they're sort of having a bob each way. They're going 50%, 50% each, that's 50-50, 50% genetics, 50% environment. So if anyone, if you're talking to someone and they get all upset about the idea that if it's all genes, then everything we've understood about human behavior and counselling and psychiatry and religion is all out the window, as it were, you can reassure them that no, it's not all genes. It's 50% environment as well. So the environment does have a big effect or a significant effect on how we behave. And okay, and then finally, genes and behavior. Now, in the human genome, most of the genes are devoted to creating the brain. So our brain is a sort of not the biggest part of our body, but it's certainly the most important. So most of and of course it's the most highly complex. I suspect that the human brain is probably the most complex thing in the known, I suppose the known universe, but we don't know much about it here. It's extremely, the human brain is extremely complex. So most of our genes are devoted to constructing the brain. And what happens, the genes don't actually give instructions for behavior, not directly. The genes give instructions for creating the proteins that then go on to build the neural networks in the brain. And it's the neural networks in our brain that influence our behavior. So there you go. So if someone says, their genes made them do it. You can say, no, it's not your genes. It's your neural networks that did it. All the genes did was tell the body to produce certain proteins, which then went on to create neural networks. Okay, well, that's all there is for today. And we'll get on with the process of learning more and more about behavioural genetics, and then launch into evolutionary psychology, which I think you will find very, very interesting.